My name's Don Ross, and I am a professor of business and economics at Oklahoma City Community College. The main thing is our economy is no longer a regionalized economy or just a specific nationwide economy. We are dealing with a modern global economy where every country is interconnected with one another. So if you have a situation where, let's say in Ukraine's example, they are dealing with the fact that they are engaged in a war with Russia right now. That's taking away their time to produce products, services, because they're concentrating specifically on mitigating the damage that Russia's doing to their country. So all of those things will have a ripple effects globally. So products and services that we may be used to getting from Ukraine or even Russia, for example, will be suppressed, which in turn, we'll have to look for potentially more expensive replacements for those products, which is why when they talk about the economy being impacted as a whole, that's really what they're talking about, is the fact that, bad news in one part of the world these days ripples all across the globe. Ukraine and Russia are both going to have monetary impacts, which means their currency is going to devalue comparative to the euro, the US dollar, the Chinese yen, the Canadian dollar. And the reason it is because what I've alluded to a little earlier. It's the fact that when you are using your production capacity to engage in war, you're not producing goods and services that the rest of the country wants. Okay. If you're not producing goods and services that the rest of the country wants, that's going to have a negative impact on your currency in the long run, because, this is kind of a regionalized war right now where it's just between Ukraine and Russia. So China's still, producing at or near capacity. Europe still is for now, knock on wood. The US is, Australia is, Africa is. So it's kind of like, I try to get it this way. If you have a neighborhood, let's say you live in a neighborhood and your 5 neighbors are working, but you're not, whose house is going to stay, up to date, who's going to have the ability to feed the members of their household, who's going to be able to buy new clothes for their household. Well, it's the 5 neighbors that are working, not you. On our money, I don't know. I would probably say doubtful, but there are going to be U.S. impacts. And the biggest one right now you're probably seeing and this is something that is so underrated and I think people don't understand a lot, is obviously Russia and Ukraine both have a very valuable natural resource, which is oil. Okay. So while Ukraine and Russia are kind of engaged in this, conflict, we're probably not getting the amount of oil to the world market we would otherwise like. Okay. So first thing you're seeing is at the pump, which, gas prices are slowly on the rise. Okay. But it doesn't just stop there. Okay. So many products actually use oil in their production process. Okay. So many products that you use on a day-to-day basis actually have some component of oil in it. So not only could we potentially see the price of gas go up or fuel, we could also see the price of just regular goods and services go up as well. So the U.S. could be impacted by that. So kind of back to your main point. Could it impact the value of our currency from a global perspective? Maybe not. But to your point, the purchasing power of the U.S.'s currency may not go as far. There could be benefits from this. Obviously, companies that are engaged in the production of bullets, military gear, components that go into military gear, obviously they can benefit from a conflict. Okay, they can especially benefit from that conflict if it expands, which we hope it doesn't. You hope it would stay Ukraine, Russia. The problem is, though, you just talked about historically, a lot of times when conflict starts in Europe, it spreads. But yeah, that could potentially be a group or an industry that could benefit from this, is kind of that military vein of our economy. So that's number one. And then you brought up a number two area that really people don't think about is, let's say this war goes on for another 24 months. The longer the war goes on, the more damage there's going to be to infrastructure in Ukraine, even into Russia to some extent, even potentially in neighboring countries. So there's always the concept of post-war reconstruction as well. That is also a very valuable business where, companies or countries that go in to help Ukraine build post-war, especially if Ukraine kind of maintains their autonomy, that's a very lucrative business. And in fact, post-World War II, the U.S. economy just exploded. And a lot of the reason for that is because Europe was in rubble, and we were best positioned to go in there and say, hey, we can kind of help build and rebuild Europe and kind of lend that hand. And it was very financially beneficial to the U.S. I don't think that's what they went in thinking, oh, this is a great thing for us, but that was kind of an outflow of it. That's a great question. I would have to do a little bit more research, but what I've read historically is the U.S. couldn't become totally independent on themselves. Does that make sense? The consumption habits of the U.S., which is one of the top 3 or 4 economies in the world, we consume a lot of oil and natural gas. So us being totally independent, probably not a near-term thing we could do. Now, could we mitigate the issue? Could we ramp up production and be less dependent on, Russia, Ukraine, even some of the Middle Eastern countries for oil and natural gas? Absolutely, we could. But there's actually two modes of thought about this. There's the concept of becoming energy independent, which you probably heard a lot about, which is, hey, the U.S., let's do as much as we can on our own, because that will, make us less reliant on regimes we don't agree with. But I think you brought up a good point. Would that be as cost effective as buying it from other parts of the world where it could be extracted cheaper? I would probably say no. There's another school of thought that the U.S. should hold on to their oil and natural gas as long as possible and use other countries. Does that make sense? That way, long term, we would actually increase our, what's the word for it? Leverage power when it comes to oil and natural gas. We use everybody else's first, and then we have ours in reserves long term. So there's 2 schools of thoughts on that. I really, couldn't give you a definitive answer on which is better. Okay, you talked about when the Soviet Union, or kind of the breakup of the Soviet Union, went from the Soviet Union to kind of Russia. And they kind of went from communism to kind of a mix of free markets and command and control. Well, one of the ways they had to do that, they had to kind of wrest control away from the old communist dictators. So what they essentially did was they made a deal with kind of the young up-and-coming businessmen in the Soviet Union and said, hey, if you will help us win these upcoming elections, which will put Boris Yeltsin in office, who's kind of a more free market thinker, we will give you key industries. Okay. So these up and coming businessmen, actually, all the natural, like the vast natural resources in the Soviet Union, et cetera, went straight from the communist dictators to these rich oligarchs. So they've kind of become the power brokers. Does that make sense? Yeah. And in the Soviet Union, or I should say Soviet Union, in Russia today, okay? Russian citizens cannot stand that happened. They feel that, you just took it from the communist dictators to these people that really didn't earn it. So what the other countries globally are trying to do is put pressure on these rich individuals in Russia who own a lot of the key industry to, repress their ability to do business globally. If they can hurt their bottom line enough, they're hoping that would put pressure on those oligarchs to go to Putin and say, like, please stop. This is economically not viable for you to do this. We're losing money hand over fist. So here's the other thing. You got to be really careful with sanctions, okay? Because if it goes too far, you can anger the Russian citizens who want nothing to do with this war. Okay, and we've done that before. We seem to make a lot of the same mistakes. So, post World War I, the U.S., France, and England put tons of sanctions on Germany to kind of make them pay for World War I. But what that essentially did is it angered the Germans so bad that they said, you know what, we're going to turn to this one dude who's this extremist, to kind of get back national pride and stuff, yada, yada, yada. the rise of the Nazi Party, and we caused way more problems than we solved by all these sanctions. So sanctions are a tricky thing. What they're trying to do is put pressure on the oligarchs to talk to Putin and say, hey, this is not financially viable for us, but you got to be careful. Now, we'll say one other thing. I hope I'm not saying too much here.
No, you're good. You can take your time.
One thing that's really interesting this time that I think is just fascinating for me is private companies jumping in the pool of sanctions against Russia. Does that make sense? Like large media conglomerates like Amazon and Google and stuff like that are trying to do their own form of sanctions, which I think is, I don't know if it's a positive or negative. That's really interesting to me that the private market is trying to get involved as well. That opens a whole other can of worms that, I don't know if that's a positive long-term or negative, but it's interesting. I'll just put it that way.
How are they imposing sanctions? Are they imposing sanctions on their products and the
Yeah, like usage, distribution, like Amazon may go in and say, you know what, we're not going to take deliveries or deliver to the Soviet Union right now. And this is just, don't quote me on this. This is just the idea. Google may say, hey, we're going to shut down your ability to use our product right now while you're at war with Ukraine, things like that. Once again, to put pressure on the common Russian citizen to, rise up and say, hey, we don't want this. We don't want, one thing I don't think a lot of people understand is with Ukraine and Russia, there's a lot of family members that are across the borders from each other. So there's a good portion of Russian citizens that probably don't want this because they don't want family members harmed and stuff like that. So I think, and I think Biden actually tried this. I think he actually reached out to some of the Middle East countries and their oil production to see if they can ramp up production, and potentially possibly we could ramp up production. And the whole thing would be to flood the market with oil and natural gas resources, because if you do that, that drops the price, and therefore Russia's not making as much money. So Biden tried initially, and the Middle East so far has been like, we don't want to listen to it. So maybe they're taking baby steps towards the right direction, but I don't think we've seen any traction yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And here's the other thing. Keep in mind, the United States is historically slow at responding to conflict in Europe. We don't react quickly because we have the Atlantic Ocean between us and Europe, where we don't react very quickly. In fact, I think it wasn't, you may want to look up this quote after the call, but it may have been Winston Churchill in the course of World War II. The United States hadn't gotten involved yet, and they were like, when is the U.S. going to get off the bench? When are they going to come help us? And he had this famous quote, and I think it was Churchill, that said, the United States always does the right thing, okay, when they've tried everything else, which I thought was pretty funny, but comment at the time. But it's kind of like that. U.S. isn't very quick to react to things like this because, frankly, we don't feel there's that great of impact initially. Now with globalization, that probably will happen a little quicker. So I do think, I try to stay apolitical as much as possible as an economist. I think Biden administration has tried initially to do some things. Is it it's going to be as aggressive or as loud as what maybe the former administration would do? Probably not, but they'll be more diplomatic behind the scenes. That's what I would say. Long term, what you would want to do is work with the Middle East and the United States and Canada to ramp up production. That's long term. That probably will be the solution. I think you bring up a good point, though. I think we're going to be in for a little bit of shock here. I think everybody's thinking, oh, $4. We are at the cap, because that was our cap last time back in 2008. This is just my personal opinion. Just one single professor at Oklahoma City Community College in the middle of, United States. I don't think we've hit the ceiling yet. I would not be surprised to see start with the 5 in Oklahoma by the summer. And that is going to put immense pressure on the middle class when it comes to how they budget. So one of the outflows of that, if the Biden administration doesn't act quick enough, they could get worked over in the November midterms, meaning you could see a lot of changeover in senators, Congress, governors, stuff like that at the state and regional level. That's not a presidential election thing yet, but you could see a big swing from maybe a slight Democratic lean in Congress to a Republican majority post-November. If these gas prices continue to rise and inflation goes along with it, people vote with their pocketbooks almost 99% of the time. So if people's income is being stretched too far, they're going to be like, we're going to try somebody else. Anything's possible because, you know, we are a product of the business cycle. And, you know, the fact is we are in an inflationary, I think most economists would agree we are in an inflationary period right now. And, you know, we may be at the peak of the business cycle, if not close to it. And what happens after a peak is a recession. It's a reality. I know it's scary. I think, you know, I think one thing that's interesting about recessions is it seems like just, you know, prior to 1980, there was kind of these long periods of economic expansion and then a kind of like a little bit of time where the recession. But it seems like with technology and just with globalization, these peaks and valleys are happening just so much quicker, you know, like 3 to 5 years of expansion, 18 months of recession, 3 to 5 years of expansion, 18 months of recession. So it almost seems like more frequent. But yeah, I think recession is a concern that would be out there just due to some of the key indicators you're seeing. You know, prices are rising very quickly, you know, production's outpacing, our consumption habits are outpacing production. So usually after that's some signals of a peak in the business cycle, and you could see a recession after that. So there's a real good possibility that if this goes longer, like you said, you know, Ukrainian citizens are going to start looking for safe havens. They may move into Western Europe, you know, and that can cause a humanitarian crisis because, you know, European countries then have to solve for things like, okay, how do we house these refugees? How do we get them food? How do we clothe them? How do we give them access to medical? Okay, that's a cost that they would not have budgeted to expect. Okay, so that's another thing that, you know, we need to be aware of is that kind of impact within broader Europe if this conflict kind of, you know, is prolonged.